September 26, 1983, just after midnight. A Soviet lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov is monitoring his country's early warning satellites when his screen lights up. American nuclear missile launch detected, heading for the Soviet Union. Then another. Then three more. 5 American ICBMs, apparently screaming towards Soviet soil. Petrov had minutes to decide. Protocol was clear: report the launch immediately. The Soviet leadership would then have roughly 20 minutes to launch a full retaliatory strike before those American missiles landed. Here's the thing. In September 1983, the Soviets were convinced an American attack was coming. Just over 3 weeks earlier, they'd shot down a Korean passenger jet that strayed into their airspace, killing 269 people. The world was furious. Reagan had called them an evil empire. Soviet intelligence was actively hunting for signs of a Western first strike. Into that pressure cooker, 5 missiles appeared on Petrov's screen. He didn't report it. Something felt wrong. A real first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. 5 made no strategic sense. He called it a system malfunction. He was right. The early warning system had a flaw. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had fooled the satellites into seeing missile launches that weren't there. If Petrov had followed protocol, you probably wouldn't be watching this video, because there wouldn't be a you or a me or much of anyone. For his actions, Petrov was not rewarded. He was reprimanded for failing to complete his logbook properly during the crisis. The incident was classified. He was reassigned and eventually retired quietly. The world didn't learn his name until the Soviet Union no longer existed. This was the Cold War. 45 years where the fate of human civilization regularly came down to luck, gut instincts, and the desperate hope that the other side wasn't crazy. How did we get here? Let's start at the beginning. First, the obvious question. Why Cold War? Because the two main players, the United States and the Soviet Union, never actually shot at each other directly. A hot war between them would have meant nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons meant everybody loses. So instead, they competed in every other way imaginable. Ideology, espionage, propaganda, Olympic medal counts, who could get to space first. And crucially, they fought through proxy wars, arming and funding other countries to do the actual bleeding. Both sides spent trillions of dollars preparing for a war they could never actually fight, which, when you think about it, is either the greatest deterrent strategy in history or the most expensive bluff ever called. To understand how we got there, we need to go back to the moment two allies realized they hated each other. April 1945. American and Soviet troops meet in the middle of a destroyed Germany. The Nazis are finished. The Allies won. For about 5 minutes, everyone was friends. The US and USSR had fought together against Hitler, but they agreed on almost nothing else. They had completely opposite visions for what the post-war world should look like. The United States wanted democratic capitalism spread across Europe, free markets, open elections, American businesses selling American products to newly rebuilt European consumers. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, wanted something very different. Stalin was paranoid, sometimes justifiably so. Russia had been invaded from the West twice in 30 years. He didn't want free markets and open borders. He wanted a buffer zone of loyal communist states between Russia and anyone who might get ideas. And here's the key. By the time the war ended, the map had already been drawn in blood. The Soviets had fought their way to Berlin from the east. The Americans and British had pushed in from the west. Where those armies met, roughly down the middle of Germany, became the dividing line of Europe. The Western Allies went home. The Red Army didn't. Elections were rigged. Opposition leaders disappeared. Communist governments were installed from Poland to Bulgaria. In March 1946, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, warning that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Behind that curtain, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, all now Soviet satellite states, their governments answering to Moscow. The West's response came in 2 parts, one economic, one military. First, the Marshall Plan. The U.S. poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, partly out of genuine humanitarian concern, partly because prosperous democracies don't usually vote communist. It was generosity with strategic benefits. The military strategy was called containment. The idea wasn't to roll back communism where it already existed. That would mean war. Instead, the U.S. would stop it from spreading even 1 inch further. The first real test came in 1948. Berlin was deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, but the city itself was split between the Allies. Stalin wanted the West out. He blockaded all roads and railways into West Berlin, trying to starve 2 million people into submission. The U.S. response was audacious. For nearly a year, American and British planes flew over 2.3 million tons of supplies into the city around the clock. At the peak, a plane landed every 30 seconds. It wasn't bloodless. 101 people died in crashes and accidents. But it worked. Stalin blinked. He lifted the blockade. The West had won the first round. By 1949, the Western powers formed NATO, a military alliance where an attack on one meant an attack on all. 6 years later, the Soviets formalized their side with the Warsaw Pact, binding together the USSR, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania into a military alliance of their own. The teams were locked in, the board was set. And then, in August 1949, the game changed completely. The United States had ended World War II with the atomic bomb. For 4 years, they were the only nuclear power on Earth. That monopoly ended in August 1949, when the Soviets tested their own bomb at a remote site in Kazakhstan, years ahead of Western predictions. The response? Build bigger bombs. The hydrogen bomb was 1,000 times more powerful than what destroyed Hiroshima. Both sides built them. Then they built delivery systems, bombers that could reach the other side of the world, and eventually intercontinental ballistic missiles that could hit any city on Earth in under 30 minutes. By the early 1960s, both superpowers would have enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over, because apparently destroying it once wasn't enough. This led to a doctrine with a grimly fitting acronym, M.A.D, mutually assured destruction. The logic went like this: if you launch your nukes at me, I'll have just enough warning to launch mine at you before yours land. So even if you win, you die too. Nobody rational would ever start that war. It was insane. It was terrifying. And it worked. The certainty of mutual annihilation became the reason neither side pulled the trigger. The Cold War stayed cold because the alternative was no war at all, just extinction. But while nuclear arsenals grew, the first real shooting of the Cold War broke out, not in Europe, but in Asia. In June 1950, Communist North Korea invaded the South. The U.S. led a UN force to push them back. China sent hundreds of thousands of troops to push back the pushback. 3 years of grinding warfare ended in July 1953, almost exactly where it started, with a divided peninsula and a ceasefire that technically still hasn't become a peace treaty. What most people don't know is that the air war wasn't entirely a proxy fight. Soviet pilots, some of them World War II aces, secretly flew MiG-15s against American jets over an area called MiG Alley. They wore Chinese uniforms and were forbidden from speaking Russian on the radio. Both sides knew the truth. Neither admitted it publicly. Acknowledging direct combat would have meant escalation neither could afford. Korea set the pattern. The superpowers could bleed each other through proxies, but direct confrontation was too dangerous. The nuclear shadow made everything more cautious and more terrifying. 3 years after Korea ended, that shadow fell over Eastern Europe. In October 1956, Hungary found out what happened when you tried to leave the Soviet bloc. Students and workers in Budapest rose up against their Soviet-backed government, demanding free elections and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a few brief days, it looked like they might win. Then the tanks came. The Soviet Union sent over 150,000 troops to crush the uprising. Around 2,500 Hungarians were killed. 200,000 fled the country as refugees. The West watched and did nothing. Hungary was behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet territory. Intervening meant risking nuclear war, so the uprising was crushed and the Cold War stayed cold. The message was brutally clear. The superpowers had divided the world, and neither would tolerate losing their half. But the competition was about to move somewhere neither side had ever been. In October 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. America panicked. If the Soviets could put something in orbit, they could drop something from orbit. The same rockets that launched satellites could carry nuclear warheads. The space race became the Cold War's most visible competition. The Soviets put the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, in April 1961. The Americans were behind and desperate to catch up. But space wasn't the only frontier. Back on Earth, the Cold War's most visible scar was about to appear. Berlin had remained a problem since the blockade. The city was still divided, but movement between East and West was relatively free. And that created an embarrassing issue for the Soviets. People kept leaving. Doctors, engineers, young people, anyone who could see that life was better on the Western side simply walked across and never came back. East Germany was bleeding talent. By 1961, nearly 3.5 million people had fled. So on the night of August 12, 1961, the Soviet-backed government did the only thing they could think of. They built a wall. Overnight, families were separated mid-sentence. Streets were cut in half. For the next 28 years, the Berlin Wall became the Cold War's defining symbol. Armed guards had orders to shoot anyone trying to cross. At least 140 people died attempting to escape to the West. It was a propaganda disaster for the Soviets. Nothing says workers' paradise like having to build a wall to keep your workers from running away. But it stopped the bleeding. The wall stood, a concrete admission that communism couldn't compete fairly. The superpowers had divided Europe, split Germany, and walled off Berlin. They'd fought through proxies in Korea and crushed dissent in Hungary. They'd raced into space and stockpiled enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over. And then, in October 1962, they came within hours of actually using them. Cuba, 90 miles from Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro had overthrown a U.S.-backed dictator and aligned with Moscow. The Soviets, seeing an opportunity, secretly began installing nuclear missiles on the island. Medium-range missiles that could hit Washington in minutes. When American spy planes discovered the construction sites in October 1962, President Kennedy had a choice: invade Cuba, bomb the missile sites, or try to negotiate. His generals pushed for airstrikes. Some wanted a full invasion. Kennedy chose a naval blockade and demanded the missiles be removed. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying more missile equipment steamed toward the blockade line. American destroyers prepared to intercept them. Both sides' nuclear forces went to their highest alert levels. B-52 bombers circled in the sky, waiting for orders. What Kennedy didn't know, some of those missiles in Cuba were already operational. Over 40,000 Soviet troops were on the island, far more than U.S. intelligence estimated. Soviet commanders had tactical nuclear weapons and, at certain points, local authority to use them. An American invasion would have triggered nuclear war before the first soldier hit the beach. At the last moment, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. Publicly, the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Privately, and this stayed secret for years, the U.S. also agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey. It was a trade, not a capitulation. But only one side got to claim victory. We survived October 1962. But both leaders were shaken. They'd stared into the abyss and seen what was waiting there. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a turning point. Both sides realized how close they'd come. In its immediate aftermath, Washington and Moscow installed a direct hotline so leaders could communicate before missiles flew. They signed a treaty banning above-ground nuclear tests, small steps back from the brink, but the Cold War was far from over. It was about to enter its longest, bloodiest chapter. The nuclear standoff continued, but the real bleeding happened far from Washington and Moscow. Vietnam. Starting in 1965, the U.S. poured combat troops into South Vietnam, trying to prevent the Communist North from taking over. The logic was containment. If Vietnam fell, the theory went, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow like dominoes. Over the course of the war, 2.7 million Americans rotated through Vietnam. At the peak, over 500,000 were there at once. The Soviets and Chinese armed and supplied the North but kept their own troops out. Unlike Korea, Americans watched this war on television. Every night, the brutality came into living rooms. The draft meant the war touched nearly every family. College campuses erupted. Trust in the government collapsed. Meanwhile, behind the Iron Curtain, another attempt at reform was crushed. In 1968, Czechoslovakia tried something dangerous: socialism with a human face. A reformist leader named Alexander Dubček loosened censorship, allowed more political freedom, tried to prove communism didn't have to mean oppression. Moscow disagreed. In August, 500,000 Warsaw Pact troops invaded. Dubček was arrested. The reforms were erased. The Prague Spring was over. Once again, the West watched and did nothing. The pattern from Hungary repeated: protest, hope, tanks, silence. By the early 1970s, both superpowers were exhausted. The Soviets needed Western technology and grain. The Americans, still bleeding in Vietnam, needed fewer enemies. The result was détente, French for relaxation of tensions. The superpowers signed arms limitation treaties. Nixon visited China, breaking the communist bloc's unity. It almost felt like the Cold War might fade into something manageable. Then, in April 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. The last Americans evacuated by helicopter from the embassy roof. Nearly 60,000 Americans were dead. On the Vietnamese side, North and South, soldiers and civilians, the death toll was measured in millions. The U.S. had lost its first war, not on the battlefield, but at home, where the will to keep fighting had simply run out. Détente limped along for a few more years, but in December 1979, it died in the mountains of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a failing communist government. It was supposed to be quick, a show of force to stabilize a neighbor. It lasted nearly 10 years. The U.S. armed and funded the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, funneling weapons through Pakistan. Afghanistan became the Soviet Vietnam, a grinding, unwinnable war against guerrillas who knew the terrain and had nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan took office in 1981 and turned up the temperature. He called the USSR an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup. He proposed a space-based missile defense system, critics called it Star Wars, that threatened to make Soviet missiles obsolete. The Soviets tried to keep up. They couldn't. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was collapsing. Decades of central planning, military overspending, corruption, and technological stagnation had hollowed out the system. People waited hours for basic goods. The communist promise of prosperity had become a bitter joke. In 1985, a new leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. Younger, reform-minded, realistic about the problems. He introduced glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. His goal was to save Soviet communism by modernizing it. Instead, he accidentally destroyed it. Once Gorbachev signaled that the Soviet Union wouldn't send tanks to crush dissent, that Hungary 1956 and Prague 1968 wouldn't repeat, the dominoes fell fast. In 1989, Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border with Austria. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution swept the communists from power without a shot. And then, on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, almost by accident. That evening, an East German official named Günter Schabowski held a press conference to announce new travel regulations. He'd been handed the papers moments before and hadn't been fully briefed. When a journalist asked when the new rules took effect, Schabowski fumbled through his notes and said, "Immediately, without delay." He was wrong. The rules were supposed to start the next day, with visa applications. But his words went out live on television. Thousands of East Berliners rushed to the checkpoints. The guards, overwhelmed and without orders, faced a choice: shoot the crowd or open the gates. They opened the gates. For 28 years, the wall had divided families, killed those who tried to cross, and symbolized everything the Cold War meant. Now ordinary people were tearing it apart with their bare hands, dancing on top of it, embracing strangers from the other side. 2 years later, on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The next day, the Supreme Soviet formally voted the Union out of existence. 15 new countries emerged from the wreckage. The Cold War, 45 years of tension, trillions of dollars, millions of lives, was over. And what did it all mean? The Cold War shaped the world we live in now. It drew borders that still cause conflicts. It funded technologies that became the internet. It left behind thousands of nuclear weapons that still exist, still armed, still waiting. The US alone spent trillions of dollars on Cold War military budgets. The Soviets, in their final years, were devoting a crippling share of their economy to defense, a burden that helped break them. It was the most expensive stare-down in human history, and it taught us something unsettling: that human survival sometimes comes down to systems failing, or one person making a judgment call, or sheer dumb luck. Remember Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer from our opening? He saw 5 American missiles on his screen and decided it must be a glitch. He reasoned that 5 missiles made no sense as a first strike. A different man, more by the book, might not have questioned it. And we'd never know because there'd be no one left to tell the story. The Cold War ended without a nuclear exchange. That's not a small thing. It's arguably the most important thing that happened in the 20th century, the apocalypse that didn't happen. But the weapons are still here. The tensions have new names and new faces, and the next Stanislav Petrov might not guess right. That's the Cold War in one video, but there are dozens of incredible stories we had to skip: spy exchanges, secret operations, nuclear close calls that would keep you up at night. If there's a specific Cold War story you want us to cover, drop it in the comments. And if this helped you understand those 45 years a little better, subscribe for more history that actually matters.